Circumcision and HIV infection, a randomized trial. These data were originally presented by Ronald Gray and a group of other authors in the journal Lancet in 2007. So, to begin with some background, most of us probably know that circumcision is the surgical removal of the foreskin of a man's penis. So there's a pretty graphic depiction there of the procedure. Basically, the foreskin is pulled out and away from the glands, and it's snipped down the top, so the foreskin can then be folded down and around the shaft of the penis and eventually removed entirely. Circumcision began as a religious ritual as early as 2300 BCE. It's currently prescribed today religiously for Muslims and Jews, but it actually gained acceptance as a medical procedure during the 19th and 20th centuries. Began as something for general hygiene and cleanliness, but since then, there have been a lot of interesting studies that have shown an association between circumcision and reduced risk of STDs, including HIV. However, this result wasn't consistent across all studies. Findings were often considered inconclusive. So many public health experts wanted a more conclusive link before it could be recommended as a public health intervention. You can imagine some of the confounding variables that might be at play. For example, very observant Muslims and Jews who are circumcised might just be engaging in less risky sexual behaviors than uncircumcised men in general, so that's why you see the association. They wanted a definitive causal relationship before they could recommend circumcision for people, for example, in AIDS-ridden areas, because the procedure is costly, it's invasive, and there can be complications. So what was really needed was a large-scale study, a randomized trial, and the impetus for performing something that large was just the scope of the HIV problem in Africa. So at about the time that the authors were conducting the study in around 2005, 6.1% of adults aged 15 to 49 were living with HIV or AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. So, a randomized trial was exactly what the authors did. They selected about 5,000 uncircumcised, HIV-negative rural Ugandan men from the district of Rakai, and they randomly placed them either into an intervention group, which was the group that was circumcised immediately, or the other half, which went to the control group. The control group was also circumcised, but only at the end of the 24-month study. So after the random assignment, they double-checked. They analyzed both groups for a number of HIV risk factors like age and marital status, a number of sexual partners, and they found no statistically significant differences between the two groups. So, the question that the researchers were really trying to answer was, will circumcision causally reduce the incidence of HIV transmission? They expected that it would, because that was what the associations had shown earlier, but they wanted a more definitive causal link, and that's what they were hoping to obtain by using the randomized design. So study participants were screened for HIV 6, 12, and 24 months after the beginning of the study. And at these follow-up visits, they were also given a questionnaire of their sexual behaviors to assess whether or not behavioral disinhibition was occurring. So behavioral disinhibition is the phenomenon where a newly circumcised man might have heard of the partial protection that circumcision could offer against HIV transmission, and so thereby start engaging in riskier sexual behaviors. So the researchers wanted to know if this was going on, and if it was, how that would mediate the relationship between circumcision and HIV risk. So here are the results that they found, and they're pretty striking. This is the incidence of HIV per 100 person years. Incidence is a public health term that refers to the number of new cases of the disease in given time periods, in this case, HIV. And a person year is just 1 year lived by one person. So they had about 5,000 study participants over the 2-year period. So the researchers had about 10,000 person years of data that they could work with. You can see here on the left is the control group, that's the uncircumcised group. They had 1.33 new cases of HIV per 100 person years. And on the right, the intervention group had a rate that was less than half that. They only had 0.66 new cases of HIV per 100 person years. Here's a different graphical representation of the data. You can see that the intervention group in blue is contracting HIV at a lower rate than the control group at all time frames along the study. So that by the end of 24 months, the cumulative risk of having contracted HIV was 1.11% in the intervention group and 2.6% in the control group. So this yielded a p-value of 0.003. Most of us have probably had some statistics, but the p-value is the probability that the difference between two groups could be obtained by random chance. The cutoff for that is usually about 0.05. So because we're more than an order of magnitude below that, we can be pretty sure that this difference isn't occurring due to random chance. There's actually a definitive causal link between circumcision and reduced incidence of HIV transmission. And so that's exactly what the authors concluded. They concluded that circumcision does causally reduce the incidence of HIV transmission by about 51 to 60%, depending on which statistical test that we use. And they also found that men in the intervention group did not adopt riskier sexual behaviors as a result of being circumcised. However, the caveat to this is that at each of the follow-up visits for both the intervention and the control group, the participants were offered information, sexual education about the risks of HIV. So one has to ask the question then, all right, are both of these groups just contracting HIV at a much lower rate than the general population because of this sex education? And if so, how does that influence the relationship between circumcision and HIV transmission? But what the authors also found was that the rate of 1.33 cases per 100 person years in the control group was identical to the incidence rate in the Rakhine population as a whole. So there doesn't seem to be an impact of the sex education. And because the study sample was so large, about 45% of eligible Rakhine men participated in the study, we can be pretty sure that these results do generalize to the broader population, both in terms of the sexual behaviors that they were engaging in, as well as the outcome of this reduced risk of HIV transmission. So, from an evolutionary perspective, something that we have to ask ourselves is, why do we even have a foreskin? Because it's associated with a number of medical problems, not only increased incidence of STD transmission, but also increased incidence of urinary tract infections in infancy, phimosis, and paraphimosis. In addition, circumcised men report less sexual dysfunction than uncircumcised men, especially erectile dysfunction. So it could be that the foreskin is just a vestigial structure left over from a recent common ancestor that was maybe able to use it better than we now can. Because we see a similar structure in animals. It's similar to the foreskin, it's usually called a prepuce. However, so it would just be a homology that is no longer beneficial for our fitness. But on the other hand, we do see some evidence of evolutionary selection on the male foreskin, because the male foreskin in humans partially covers the glands of the penis even when it's erect, whereas animal prepupuses don't do that. One author found that the partial covering of the glands of the penis during intercourse reduced the amount of pressure needed to insert the penis into the vagina. So this could make intercourse more comfortable and possibly more reproductively successful. But we can't adjudicate perfectly between these two different influences. We don't know how each of them sort of weighted or impacted our recent evolutionary past. There seems to be advantages and drawbacks. So, the authors sort of concluded their study with advancing a couple of possible biological mechanisms by which circumcision might be reducing HIV transmission. And the first hypothesis that they suggested was just that the foreskin is rich in HIV target cells. So this includes things like T cells and macrophages. So there are a lot of different opportunities for HIV to infect the host. But in addition, housing the glands of the penis within the protective sheathing of the foreskin at all times makes it more sensitive or unkeratinized, and this makes it more susceptible to microtears during intercourse, which can facilitate the entry of not only HIV, but other pathogens as well. So, in conclusion, the authors did find that circumcision causally reduced the incidence of HIV transmission, and they found that the study participants did not engage in riskier sexual behaviors as a result. So we want to thank those scientists for performing this enormous study and making that data available to us, as well as making circumcision available to those who otherwise wouldn't be able